Quaker meeting for worship is rooted in silence, but the silence is not emptiness. Rather, friends gather in expectant waiting. Jennifer, could I ask you to read this next slide?
Quakers, also called friends, believe that there is that of God in all people, and through meeting for worship, we make space to encounter it.
And Susan, could you share this next slide?
Anyone at a Quaker meeting might be led to speak. Ministry and encounters with spirit may also occur in silence.
Quakers use many names and metaphors to describe the divine. Some of them include God, the light, Christ, Spirit, the guide, the seed, the life, and the inward teacher. And we hope that you will come up with many more names to describe your experiences of the divine and share them with us. Now, let's get into tonight's topic. We will be speaking about listening in tongues, listening behind the words. And with that, I would like to ask Jennifer, if you could please spotlight me, Alex Levering-Kern, and Cornelia Parks. We will get started with our conversation. And for those who are participating, I'll have a few questions to get our panelists started. And then I hope that you'll be thinking about what kinds of questions you have, or what sort of reactions you have that you might like to share with the group. Okay, and now I'm gonna successfully unshare my screen. There we go. Okay. So to get us started, thank you so much for being here, Alex and Cornelia. I'm really excited to talk to you both about this topic. To get started, I wonder if you could each in turn just share a little bit about this idea of listening behind the words. What does that look like and feel like for you? How do you describe it? And what does that mean for you?
So who's supposed to go first?
Well, I think you might have just volunteered, Cornelia. Take it away.
I'm looking at Alex. Well, listening is really the heart of everything during meeting for worship. And the fact that we're silent is actually a way that enables listening. And I have a little quote here about listening. It is, quote, "Listening happens in many ways. It could be a clear inner voice, intuitive knowing, visual impressions, a felt sense, or any number of means. Learning to recognize how we listen, to develop the inner muscles of trust and discernment that allow us to refine our, quote, listening, takes patience, perseverance, and perseverance, and a readiness to make mistakes that we can take the time to learn from." I'll let that sink in a little bit. So listening isn't just something that happens because you know how to talk, you know how to listen. There really, there really is a discipline to it. And the discipline behind listening is the quiet mind. That's one of the reasons we ask people to have pauses between messages during meeting for worship. It's one, so that the listeners can ponder what is said, but it's also a reminder that when someone is speaking, you're not preparing what you want to say, because then you are not listening. I have a little story about listening behind the words that comes from Quaker lore. John Woolman is a Quaker living in the 18th century. Actually, this event took place in 1762 in the middle of the French, so-called French and Indian Wars. Quaker, John Woolman was a Quaker who was very moved by the sin of slavery. And it was usually his mission, his calling, to labor with Quakers who held slaves at that time. But this year, in 1761, actually, he had a calling to visit the Indians, who, of course, they were at war with. He sat with that calling for a whole year before he brought it to his monthly meeting, or even told his wife about it, because he knew that everyone would advise him against going.
Mhm.
It's so significant why he went on his journey. And I'm quoting from his journal for that year. I was led to think on the nature of the exercise which hath attended me. Love was the first motion, and thence a concern arose to spend some time with the Indians, that I might feel and understand their life and the spirit they live in. If haply I might receive some instruction from them, or they might be in any degree helped forward by my following the leadings of truth among them. And as it pleased the Lord to make way for my going at a time when the troubles of the war were increasing. There are really important messages in here that are part of Quaker lore besides listening. And there's a quote that you will hear often. Love was the first motion. That's the reason for all action. And then he went to visit the Indians, not to teach them, but to try to understand their life, and that I might receive instruction from them. These are people with whom there was a war, right? His journey is amazing. If you ever want to read his journal, the difficulties of getting from where he was to the Indian village make exciting reading. But I'm just going to quote next from the experience he had in speaking to them. And that is definitely an exercise in speaking in tongues, because he had interpreters, but they were having difficulty with what he was saying, and we're messing it up, frankly. And so he said, well, I want to offer a prayer, and maybe just don't try to interpret, okay? So he stood up and spoke his prayer. And he felt he was speaking under the divine guidance. I quote again, before the people went out, I observed Papunehog, the man who had been zealous in laboring for a reformation in that town, being then very tender, speaking to one of the interpreters. And I was afterwards told that he said in substance as follows: I love to feel where the words come from.
Hmm.
And that's all I have prepared.
Thanks, Cornelia. I have many questions I want to ask you about that. But first, Alex, could we hear from you a little bit about the practice of spiritual translation, what it feels like for you, how it is for you?
Sure. How is my volume?
Great.
Excellent. Okay. Good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are, friends. My name is Alex Levering Kern, he, him, his pronouns. And I've been a member of Friends Meeting at Cambridge since 1999. And I'm really grateful to the wonderful Susan, Veronica, and Jen for inviting me, and for my friend and teacher in the spirit, Cornelia, for sharing this time. Now, for someone who does a lot of public speaking, as I do, I find myself always getting remarkably anxious beforehand. So I would love your indulgence and invite you to just hold in the light me and each of us, our words and our listening this evening. So the experience of listening behind the words, I'm so grateful that Cornelia shared the words of John Woolman and the sense from the Wyalusing Indian leader that once Woolman decided that he would prefer not to have his words translated, that there was a kindred spirit, a soul connection that he felt with another, and that the other felt with him. And that the Wyalusing chief said, I love to hear where the words come from. I love to feel, rather, where words come from. And I think love, as Cornelia has pointed out, is at the root of our life together. I believe it's at the root of the divine nature. You know, probably the message I internalized most as a child listening to my grandmother was that if anything, God is love. So, and that at the core of our ethic is to love one another, to love our neighbor, even if possible, somehow to love our enemy or those with whom we strongly disagree. So I believe that the work of listening behind the words is a gesture of love. And in my own experience, to come into the presence of love, just describing anecdotally, I'm usually hurried, harried, maybe a minute or two late, rushing to meeting, full of 1,000 thoughts, feelings, sensations, perceptions, basically in a place of monkey mind. I would love to tell you that I come to meeting with heart and mind prepared, as the elders instructed us in faith and practice. And I do try to spend some time at home listening to sacred music, or reading Quaker texts or scriptures, coming into a meditative place. But, you know, the commute destroys all of that centeredness. So coming into the place, I find myself listening probably first to that mental chatter. And if I'm gracious and loving with myself in the moment, extending a gentleness. Alex, your mind and your heart are all over the place. So listening to that and extending the love toward myself that I might toward others, that I hope I will toward others. And then there's a process of listening to the room, um, the sweet shuffling of folks in the benches as they, find their centered posture, whatever noises kids may be making outside, the sound of wind or rain, and I think all of that listening is actually listening to the way Spirit or God is manifesting Spirit self in our sacred space. I know that's heresy for Quakers to speak of sacred space, but Quakers have our heretical streak dating back to the 1640s, 1650s. So I'm going to own it. True confession. I have sacred spaces in my life, wild spaces, beautiful places, and Friends Meeting is one. So there's a listening to self, there's a listening to the room, listening to friends, and the process of centering down is listening for the voice, the motion, the presence, finally the love and embrace and nurture, listening into the womb of God. And that usually takes about 20 minutes on a good day. And it's often about 20 minutes or half an hour before someone will rise to speak. And I find myself, and perhaps some of you do too, when you're in what's called the exercise of the meeting, or when you've been at it for decades, sometimes you can sense the Spirit moving people around the room. They might be visibly quaking. There might be a little sigh of anxiety. There might be I sense it's coming from whichever corner of the room, and sometimes, well, I will have been praying among many prayers during the centering down, but that the Spirit might speak to us, and that I might be in a place, and we might be in a place to receive and gain some comfort, some encouragement, some inspiration, some challenge, some spiritual nurture from whatever vocal ministry is offered. So I like to give ministry the benefit of the doubt, that it's an answered prayer. Probably not my own prayer. Maybe many of us, those of us who have care of meeting, are certainly holding the vocal ministry in the light, or holding it prayerfully. And I will say that the most important thing about this listening process, one of my other Quaker heroes, sheroes, theyros beyond John Woolman, is a 20th century friend named Thomas R. Kelly, whose book, Testament of Devotion, I think is probably the greatest piece of Quaker spiritual literature of the 20th century. And one of his major points, echoing early friends, is that God is always within, and that what I think of as my spiritual journey, my prayer, my initiative, my practice, my discipline, is actually really all just a response to God, or to the Spirit, or to the light. That Kelly's got this line about, God is the initiator and we are the responders. That, even the desire to pray is the Spirit desiring to pray within us. So if there's one thing that I want to say that's been it's been tickling my spiritual, not my spiritual funny bone, but tickling my spiritual curiosity all day, is this idea that my listening is not my listening, our listening is not our listening, that there is one who is listening always to every human being on the planet. No, every being on the planet. That there's just a divine listener. And one of my spiritual mentors from another tradition says, God is all ears. God's got all the time in the world. God's all ears, and God is always more than you think God is. So I like to think that my own listening begins with being listened through, just as my own vocal ministry in some ways is a being spoken through. And just very briefly, one anecdote about how it feels. Listening to another can feel, it can feel very challenging. It can feel, I struggle sometimes to get past my judgments or my assumptions or my presuppositions about people I know and love and have known for 21 years. And, I drive them crazy probably on a weekly basis. They drive me crazy maybe every 6 months or so. But so that there is, truth be told, like a suspension and an effort to open the ears of the heart, to let the Holy One listen through me, is to suspend that judgment and prepare for holy surprise. Because I think vocal ministry and meeting for worship, it's a great experiment in holy surprise. And the anecdote that I want to share is, it was never surprising, but when I came into Friends meeting in Cambridge, there was a wonderful elderly Quaker named Eloise Houghton, and like clockwork, before the children left in the first 15 minutes, like clockwork, Eloise would stand and offer a message to the children. And I loved listening to her vocal ministry. And there was a part of me also which was like, it's curious to me that God always speaks to Eloise to speak to the children at about 13 minutes after the hour. And I know that there are old stories about weighty Quakers like Rufus Jones, and one of the great Quaker mystics. Yeah, people could, kind of put their watch out and, okay, it's students at Haverford College would be like, okay, it's about 7 minutes until Rufus is going to speak in meeting for worship. So that's not really the idea, but there was a little bit of that with Eloise's ministry. And what I found so beautifully surprising with her is that, like, I needed a grandmother in my life. I always need many grandmothers in my life, but I needed a grandmother in my life, and I needed someone to speak to me sometimes as if it were a bedtime story, or to just break it down to like the most elemental spiritual truths. And I felt the way that some of the early followers of Jesus must have felt when Jesus was like, you have to become like children, become open and innocent and wide-eyed and curious, become like children, or what the philosopher Paul Ricoeur said, a second naivete, a new kind of openness with the eyes of a child, a new coming into new creation. And so that's what Eloise did for me in vocal ministry. Just an anecdote about listening behind the words. I can't tell you anything she said. I can remember precisely the spirit in which she spoke, her tone of voice, the look in her eye, and the effect it had on the room. So I will leave it there for now, and turn it back to Veronica. Veronica, you haven't given us any guidance in terms of time, because I know I could just keep on yakking all night, but I'm not going to do that, because then
Don't worry. I have many
you'll be
questions.
listening behind the words all night long, and we don't want that.
So we're just gonna have a conversation. So I have many more questions for you, but I also suspect that the rest of the participants might also have things that they are listening and thinking about that they might want to bring into the conversation as well. So one thing I want to ask you both about, I'm struck by in what you've just shared, this sense of senses in your description of listening. That listening we might think of as just something that you do with your ears, but I'm struck by the fact that both of you seem to have described it as much bigger than just one sense. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Cornelia, with answering these questions, do you want to do that venerable Quaker decision-making process of rock, paper, scissors, or what?
Please, if you can say something, say something.
Also, there's no obligation for both of you to answer every question. So,
Would you like first dibs on this?
Okay, well, it takes me a bit to collect an answer. And yes, what are we listening for? And I think that when we're listening for what's behind the words, what we're listening for is truth. And knowing truth is the way I see it. We don't learn truth, we recognize truth.
Mhm.
And that is a whole body experience. That's how come Quakers shake. I have something I have to say. And unless I get really agitated, I really surely may not want to say it. It's and it's listening with the heart. And it's also listening with the mind, clicking off things, yes, 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 like that. And visually, I can't think of how it works out visually, but maybe I'm a more auditory person than a visual person. So I'll leave it at that.
When you describe this, Cornelia, I can't help but think about, like, when you say you're a more auditory person, the thing that leaps to my mind is, like, if you're singing in harmony with people, there's a moment where it just goes, and you're like, yes, we are in harmony. We're singing together. And I'm thinking of, I've had that experience dancing with people too, where you are, you're in the same, you recognize it with your whole body, that you've tuned in to the same thing.
Mhm. Likewise for both of those.
Is there a term for that? Entrainment? I mean, I tend to think of a responsive chord, or answering that of God in one another, answering the witness, or being in the, I don't want to say the force field because that sounds too violent, and but being in the swimming in the spirit together. But yeah, is entrainment the word for that kind of, we're vibing together?
I have to say, I like the phrase "we're vibing together." I don't know the word entrainment. Can you tell us what that means?
I think it means, I'm gonna have to Google it. It's not an early Quaker word, that's for sure. It's got something to do with flow and synergy. I think it speaks to a lot of the synchronicity and serendipity that happens in meetings. Sometimes the listening involves listening within and then hearing someone speak, not only to my condition, but maybe exactly or close to what I was going to say. And I know many people have had that experience. And Cornelia and I talked a bit about that in preparation, but and maybe we can talk more about that. But I think the visual of dimension to the full body listening experience, for me, might be if my eyes are closed, like the beautiful stained glass of light behind the eyelids is a visual dimension, or if I'm looking at the person, just a sense of holding them in the light, like literally them being in the light, and seeing, literally seeing a measure of God in them. Like, wow, this is what the beauty of the human person as a mouthpiece or a messenger of the Holy One looks like, or just by virtue of being being an infinitely worthy and precious and beloved and beautiful human being who just happens to have a word for us today. Yeah, that's the visual, is the visual of the person, and then the visual of everyone else quietly listening. It's pretty astonishing, and it's revolutionary. I mean, it's profoundly countercultural. I'm amazed every time. I'm like, how did this happen? This amazing fact of Quaker worship, as one book title has it.
So I want to open up. We have a wonderful question in the chat, and it's one that speaks to a question that I was holding for this evening as well. So what if you hear a message in meeting that confuses you or does not speak to you, or you might even find it upsetting or off-putting? I wonder if either of you could share something from your personal experience about that, about how you've approached a message like that that really doesn't quite land for you at first.
I think there's a difference between something that is just confusing. If it's just confusing, you can just let it pass through, you know. I didn't get that, whatever it was. It's almost like when you only hear half of a message because of these microphone difficulties and things like that.
Mm.
But there's a more serious aspect, is when what a person says and what you think you heard is upsetting to you, in the sense that it may somehow violate your sense of identity.
Mm.
And I think that one of the things you need to realize is that the meeting is always under the care of ministry and council. And ministry and council is holding the meeting, and others too, of course, are holding the meeting in prayer and holding everyone in prayer. And
actually, could I just interrupt you for a moment, Cornelia, to name that Cornelia is referring to the Ministry and Council Committee, which is a group of friends who share that responsibility. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about that. I think you're about to get into that.
I think Alex should speak to that, because he's currently on ministry and council, and I'm way back when I was on it.
Well, I can, and that's just for those who are very new. And it's wonderful to see so many names that I don't recognize, probably from around the country, if not the globe. So thank you for coming and being with us. So Ministry and Council is the body, one among many committees at our meeting that has special care for the spiritual life and the worship life of the community. And the person who has what's called care of meeting sits at the head of meeting and is responsible for closing meeting when the hour has come, is responsible for facilitating announcements, and is responsible in extremis for responding to messages that may be spoken that are the old Quaker term would have been out of the life. Now we might say messages that are racist, sexist, homophobic, religiously bigoted, transphobic, hateful, violent, or in some cases, I've actually had care of meeting while on ministry and council, and I think Jennifer Hogue, one of our hosts here this evening, kind of, I don't know whether she was teasing me or whether it was like a thank God it wasn't her or someone else, but she once said that, you know, there have been like 4 or 5 times where I've had care of meeting over the last 21 years where I've felt the need to intervene, or felt the Spirit's prompting to intervene. And one example of that would be someone standing and speaking out of a place where they were clearly, drunk or high, and not really sensible, and it was not clear where the message was going or when it might end. And another message had to do with someone saying that he was sent on a special mission to ordain us all, and for me that violated my sense that, well, first, Quakers don't ordain. Second of all, it's not your right or role in this meeting to claim that power. So I think there are a variety of situations, but Cornelia, I think, is correct in distinguishing between those messages that are confusing, those messages that are obviously offensive or troubling to many and need some response during meeting or at the rise of meeting. And then I would add a third category, which is just those messages that don't speak to me for one reason or another. And one of my mentors said, just sort of pop your head up from your contemplative prayer, from your, deep centered stillness, listen for a moment. And usually within a minute or two, I can tell whether the message is for me. And I think part of the radical hospitality and generosity that I aspire to when I'm not in my, a judgy place or whatever, or in my kind of dissecting blah blah blah, but at my best, just trusting that the message is for someone else or someone's else. And the amazingly beautiful thing about it is sometimes if I listen long enough, there'll be one word. That happened to me just recently. Someone was speaking and I was like, where's this going? Just one word. It was that, literally one word was what the Spirit had for me that day from an improbable, what to me might be an improbable source. So I was really grateful for that.
Thank you, Alex. And I wonder, Cornelia, you were beginning to speak a little bit about messages that might violate one's sense of identity as being a way that a message might be hard to hear. I wonder if you might want to expand on that a little bit.
I think it's a real problem. And I was hoping that Alex would say that actually ministering counsel, and maybe you did say this, Alex, that ministering counsel is prepared to address the issue when it comes up. You are. I know you are.
Yes, we are. We have a variety of different texts that we have crafted that can be used, and or we rely on the Holy Spirit to give us the words in the moment. So yes, we are prepared and have workshopped a variety of different scenarios and experienced virtually everything under the sun. And it's very rare. For those who are new, this is, this might be a once a year, if that, 1 in 52 times a year.
So we have some wonderful responses in the chat, including, let's see, we have remarks from our friend who shares, in my meeting, we would go into worship and allow the Spirit to speak. Most likely something usually rises that we knew not of. Spirit is amazing in that way. Thank you for sharing that, Barbara. And then we have a couple of wonderful questions here as well. Now, I'm wondering, those who have asked questions in the chat, if you would like to jump in with your own voice and ask your question, feel free to raise your Zoom hand. That's under the reactions. But if not, I would love to ask these questions. So we've got two great ones in here. This is, I feel like it's a wonderful age-old question to come back to. How do you know if a message is to be shared out loud in meeting? And I would especially, since we're talking about listening this evening, I would ask, what does listening have to do with that? Finding out whether a message is to be shared out loud. I like that smile that just appeared on your face, Cornelia.
So yeah, it's yeah, listening to your inner teacher is the first step before speaking. And yeah, I can go through meetings and hold a message and hold a message and hold a message. Sometimes someone else speaks the message, and I'm so relieved because I didn't have to say it. And they said it much better than I could possibly say it, because I was off on some little tangent here and they got right to the point. Good. Okay. Uh, the other times I hold a message, and it's based on something that someone else has said. And so then I have to go through the process of saying, well, this isn't a discussion, but what they said did trigger me along this line. And is this necessary? Right. And that's why I like afterthoughts so much, because I can say, okay, if it doesn't need to be said now, and it is like a cogitated, thoughtful thing as opposed to spirit-led thing, I save it for afterthoughts. But the absolute worst thing that can possibly happen is that you have a message to give. You know you have to give the message and you don't give it.
Mm.
And that is just, I've burst into tears after meeting for worship because I was not faithful to give the message that I had to give.
A powerful answer.
Mm.
I think, Alex, you're welcome to add to that if you'd like. And we also have another wonderful question in the chat. And then I think we might have time for just one more question after that. So if there's anyone who's out there sitting on your question thinking, I don't know if I'm going to ask it, this is a special invitation to you to raise your hand or drop your question in the chat. Alex, did you want to add anything to that, or shall we move on to the next?
Yeah, I'll just add that that the listening is an act of discernment, and the whole of vocal ministry to me is putting out the begging bowl, or putting up the spiritual antennae, and seeing, mulling in a way prayerfully, the whatever songs come into my consciousness, whatever snatches of poetry or scripture, whatever encounters with homeless folks or children, whatever moments of truth have been, and praying around all that, and then intentionally praying, not what is a personal discovery for me, like what insight for me have I found, but actually praying about, is this for me, or is this for the body of the whole? Are there, God, help me to speak to others' condition. Is there something that I might say that would be of encouragement or consolation, or challenge or hope for others? That I think that vocal ministry is an act of service leadership, and it's most kind of akin, I think, to the process of writing a poem. I write poems, and it's like one image or one sound or one snatch, one thread presents itself, and then to, as a poet William Stafford says, to just hold on to that thread and see where it leads. And then there's usually there's always for me a pretty powerful physical, beating heart, quaking body, compulsion to stand. But I would like to encourage anyone who ever wonders whether they have a calling to vocal ministry in general, or at a particular time, to just talk with others about it. We have this kind of strange privatized awkwardness around vocal ministry, I think, in Quaker culture, and we really need to open up about it and encourage one another to step into that, if we feel an inkling of a call. So
Thank you, Alex. All right, so we have two more questions, and I see Cornelia has something to say. Yes.
There's a hand up too from Daniel.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you. I see that.
I mentioned afterthoughts, and I see in the chat someone saying, what is afterthoughts? And that is a time at the Cambridge meeting where we go into worship sharing to bring questions about anything that has happened in meeting for worship and concerns, and then also to speak messages that just didn't rise to the level of being spoken during meeting. Afterthoughts is a place to share these and talk about them. And as Alex just said, um, talk about, how it felt, whether you should have, whether you wanted to say it or not. I mean, it's a time for processing what happens, and it's often very necessary after a controversial or a deep or any meeting for worship. So it's just a separate gathering after meeting. You're muted, Veronica.
Thank you. Yes. So we have two more questions, and I'll just say that in order to leave some time for our small group conversations, we may not have time for both of you to answer both questions, but I'm going to raise both of them, and perhaps you can see which ones speak to you. So I think this is a wonderful question. I see a question about, my meeting includes Jewish Quakers. I am Christ-centered. Does my vocal ministry offend?
Um,
Go for it, Alex.
I would need more information probably about the nature and content of your vocal ministry, and knowing more about the Jewish Friends. So I'm not able to respond, I guess, clearly to that. I will say that from all I've studied, learned, been mentored in, like Quakerism is a wonderfully wide tent, wildly varied theologically. But there's a resource that I commend to everyone, a little chart by Fran and Bill Tabor about discovering the center of Quakerism, and it really is this universalist Christianity or Christian universalism, this idea of the light which was in Christ and of Christ, in everyone, and everyone having access to truth. And at the same, so I hope those of us who are Christian or Christ-centered or followers of Jesus or Christian universalists or whatever, I often, for a long time, I felt very inhibited by non-theist friends and wondering whether my ministry was welcome at Friends meeting at Cambridge. And I think, now doing higher ed, interfaith chaplaincy and being so acutely aware of the histories of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. But I would like to think that Friends meeting is a moment where, when Spirit leads, you speak the truth that you're given, and if your truth is the light of Christ, or the teachings of the Prince of Peace, or what have you, that I hope that I've heard that it's the responsibility of the listeners to adjust their headset rather than of the speakers to censor what they've been given. So and to do that, for everyone to do that lovingly and openly in conversation. Yeah, talking with folks. I think there'd be no substitute for talking with folks.
Yeah, thank you. And I would like to add a little of my own experience as a non-theist friend, that I certainly don't want to speak for everybody's experience. So I can't speak to, this specific Jewish friend in this meeting, obviously. But I will say for myself, it has actually been very healing for me to be part of a community where I've, been able to recognize, like, I can hear the light in what this Christ-centered friend says, and that's wonderful. And there's a sense that no one is expecting me to use the same words, whether it's Christ-centered words or any number of other ways. It's remarkable how that listening behind the words can be, in my experience, very healing in that way. Okay, so we have one more question. Let me see. I believe we had a hand raised.
Daniel,
And Daniel. Can we go ahead and spotlight Daniel and bring Daniel into this?
sure, maybe. I'll try.
Welcome, Daniel.
Hi, let me put my hand down. First of all, thank you guys for having this. I am a friend who attends a meeting in Washington, D.C., and I bring friendly greetings from Friends Meeting of Washington. I was kind of inspired by Cornelia's message about the difference between things that are cogitated and things that are spirit-led, and I really like the way that you put that. But it's something that I've kind of been struggling with for a little while now. I think one of my favorite criticisms I've ever read of a thinker was that he was clever but not deep. And I ended up disagreeing with that estimation, but I think there's a difference between things that are clever and things that are wise, but I'm also a little despairing of the idea that we can't be still careful in our thinking, even as we are spirit-led. So I hope that, if you wouldn't mind speaking to that a little bit more.
Oh dear. Okay, let's try. So one of the things I've heard is that when you rise to speak, you should not, you should let the spirit flow freely and not know what you're going to say. I can't do that. I really do know what I want to say, and I don't really say it, but that's the other problem. But I do have something in me that needs to come out. And as to whether, it comes from your heart, but yeah, it definitely, I have a, how can I think about it. Okay, so my mind is also involved, and yeah, I mean, it couldn't really be otherwise because I have to put it into sentences. We're really not speaking in tongues, right? We are speaking in a language. And I'm trying to think. I think one of the last messages I gave was about the geese. And I have been sitting there really feeling that I was flying with the geese. And so what I had to do was to translate the emotion that I had of being at one with the geese in the sky into words. And frankly, at that point, I don't really know what I said, but people remembered that I talked about geese. That's the other thing. After I talk, don't ask me what I said. And also it doesn't really matter because you hear what you need to hear. I'm sometimes quite amazed. Does that answer?
Helps.
Okay.
And we have some beautiful contributions from the chat. The question of who put it on your heart? And also a sharing of John Woolman pondered messages he felt a need to give let rise for long periods before he spoke them, as was shared in your story earlier. Thank you both. Thank you, Barbara and Kathy, for sharing that. So friends, any additional, I hope that everyone is simmering with, lots more, whatever is bothering you right now, or that's inspiring you right now, or that is making you curious right now, because we are now going to take a few moments to speak with each other. So now would be a great moment. My request to you would be, if you do not wish to go into a breakout room, if you'd rather take a few minutes for journaling on your own. If you wouldn't mind renaming yourself with an equal sign in front of your name, if you don't want to go to a breakout room to chat with others. But otherwise, Jennifer is going to be behind the scenes magically putting us into groups of 3. And you'll have a chance to speak with some other friends for about, let's see, we're going to take about 15 minutes. We might pull you back just a little bit earlier than that, but we're going to send you out with 3 folks to talk about this question. Have you ever had an experience of spiritual translation or hearing something behind the words? And what does listening behind the words look or feel like for you? Now this, I just want to say, this could be in the context of a Quaker meeting, or it might be out in the world. If you've ever had what felt like an experience of listening behind the words, or for spirit behind the words of something that's happening out in your life elsewhere. So anyone who does not prefer to go out into a breakout room, we invite you to, as I mentioned, you can either let us know by putting an equal sign in your name, but you can also just decline your breakout room and stay here in the main room. We would encourage you to take some time with a journal or in quiet contemplation about that question. And otherwise, Jennifer, are we ready to head out into our small group conversations?
Yeah, so I haven't had time to actually make a separate, to pull out the equal sign people. So I'm just going to say to people, I might move you around in your breakout rooms a little bit. If there aren't enough people in your breakout room, I'll put you in a room where there are enough people. So just sit tight and everyone will be where they want to be shortly. I hope.
And you're always welcome to just come back here to the main room as needed. And we are also going to close the recording at this point. So I'm going to bid a goodbye to future people who may be watching, but I would encourage you to take a few moments with your journal to contemplate these questions. And we're going to close the recording there.